Hi, in this video we are going to make a bar chart using D3.js. First, we make a folder for this. Okay, we have the folder bar chart. We cd into the bar chart folder. We have no files inside it. Let's create index.html, script.js. So these are the files. Now let's make a style.css file for CSS. So we have all the three required files now. Now we are going to open it with Visual Studio Code. So here we can see that we have our index.html, script.js, and style.css. I'm going to copy directly code into this file style.css because in this video I'm not going to explain CSS. So this is the CSS code that we are going to use. This is the body section for the main section that we will have. Like, let's make the main section. Here is an index.html. I'm just pressing this exclamation sign mark, and then I will press the tab on my keyboard, and that will write all this code for me. Here, inside the body part, I need this main, and that is why I have here in style.css, I have this formatting for the main section. For the title of the chart, the tooltip of the chart, some classes here, .bar, hovering, .bar 2x's, and domain and description, etc. For the HTML section, we can create here a title, bar chart using D3.js. And here, inside, we need some script. So why do we need this script? Because we are using D3.js, so we have to import it or use it somewhere. So instead of importing it inside our file script.js, we are just linking here using the script tag and the source. So we are using this version 7 here, and we are using the minimum version, not the full version. And here we are linking the freecodecamp automatic tests, since this is a project of freecodecamp for completing the course D3.js. So once we have completed the project, we will need to run the automatic tests in order to test our project, whether it has passed all the tests or not. Here we are linking our local file script.js. This is the module, this is the file where we are going to write all our JavaScript. And we also have a file style.css, so we need to link it as well here. So style.css, this is the code that we have here in style.css for the formatting. We need to link it over here. So that's all for our HTML. This is the main part, main/main, where we are going to make the graph. So for that, let's go to the script.js file and start writing code in JavaScript. So let's start by writing a function called driver. And we will call this driver to start the program. So we need a title for the chart. So we will write a function to create this title. We need a canvas, so we will write a function to create a canvas. We will need to show tooltips. Let me show you the finished chart. Like, this is the chart that we are going to make. So we need a title. We also have x-axis here, we have y-axis here, we have the data of the chart, and this is the tooltip. When I put my mouse on the data, for example, for this year, when the date is 2000 and the month is 10th and the date is first of the month, so we have $10,472.3 billion. Now this is the data that we are showing here. This is because of the tooltip function that we are going to write. That tooltip function will cause this to show whenever I move the mouse and put my mouse anywhere inside this chart. So here we are going to write a function for that as well. Create tooltip. And then we will need to send a request to the API to get the data, because we need data to make this chart, and that data comes from an API. So we are going to write a function to get that data. So we need to write send request to API. And after that, after that we are going to write a function onload. But we are not going to call this function onload ourselves. We just need to write the whole function and the instructions inside the function. And then we can see here in the comments that it will be called after the send, which means that we are going to write another function, not write, but call another function send. And once that function is called, so that function will automatically call our onload function. So this XML HTTP.onload function, it will be called after the send function by the XHR infrastructure. The programmer doesn't call XML HTTP.onload. So we do not call this onload function. We just write code inside the onload function. We will write a function here above and write this inside the onload function. We will write a lot of code, and that code will be called automatically. The programmer doesn't need to call that function. That function will be called automatically once we call the send function. So let's start by writing these functions one by one. So at the top of the file, we start by writing XML HTTP, a variable, and we create a new XML, this one, XML HTTP request. Use XML HTTP request XHR objects to interact with servers. So we will need to interact with servers to fetch data from the API. That is why we are going to need this. We also need another variable SVG for the scalar vector graphics. We need an object for the size of this SVG. Let's make the width to 900 and height to 500. We need to do some padding. For the horizontal padding on the x-axis, we can have 60, and for the y-axis we need 30. Why do we need more for x-axis? Because if you look at the chart here on axis we need more place, because we have to write this 2000, 4000, 6000, 8000, this data. So this needs more place. So we need more padding over here. But we don't need more padding here or here. We don't need that much padding here. Next, we write the function create title. And we can directly return from it this D3. dot select, and we select main. This is what we have here in HTML inside the body main. So this, we are returning this. Here we select it first, D3.select main. Now in order to format our code, we come to the next line, and then we append to it the title of the chart, this one, United States GDP. We are going to append that to the main section. After appending that, we need to give it to the attribute ID. So what is the ID of this title? Let's use the same title. And then the text, this text that we see here on the chart, that is what we are going to set now. United States GDP. So that is what we are returning from this create title from this function. The next thing is create canvas. Let's make the canvas now. Const svg scalar vector graphics. We use D3 and select the main once again, the main inside our HTML, this part. We append svg to the main. Now we need to define the width and height of this svg. We can use like the attribute width, and then we have the canvas size. I think we have here, yeah, svg size. So we use that svg size dot width. We can set the height. And then we return the svg. So this svg that we are returning, we can assign it here to the global svg that we have above. So this svg, this is this global svg, like window.svg, this window object, and this is the svg property of the window objects. We are assigning to that svg here this one that we are returning from the function create canvas. So now we have created the canvas. Next we can go to create tooltip. We can return from this function D3.select the body. So like inside our HTML, we have this body. After selecting the body, we append a div. Let's set the attributes, the ID of this tooltip, and let's give it the tooltip ID. So the ID of this tooltip is tooltip. So later on, when we need to refer to this object, so we need to refer to it with this ID tooltip. And that was all about the create tooltip function. The next is send request to the server, to the API. So let's write the function send request to API now. So we have this XML HTTP. Here down, when we are calling this send request to HTTP, we can assign the return and we can also send it as an argument. So we are sending this XML HTTP to send request to API here. So this is a local variable inside now. We need a URL from where we are going to fetch our data. This is the URL where we get the data in JSON format. This is the data. This is the URL of the data here. So if you look at the data, it returns an object. Inside the object, we have this key and value, like the key ID. This is the ID, source name, we have source code, we have code, name, and all this stuff. But here, if we come here, then we have the data, and data returns an array of arrays. Inside each array, then we have one array, and in that array we have year, and then we have the GDP for that year. So this is 1st April 1947, and the GDP is 246.3. So this array of arrays, we can refer to it by data, but this data itself is inside an object which we get as data. So if we want to get access to this data, we will have to access data, or whatever we call this object, that object dot data. So I have already copied this URL, and that is what we are going to use here inside this const URL. What method we are going to use? We are going to use the get method. So using this XML HTTP object, we are going to use the function open using the method, and the method is get, sending it the URL, which is here above, and then we send it true. True is for the asynchronous, which is a Boolean. So here we are setting the value to true. This send request to API, I misspelled over here. This will return this object. So since XML HTTP was local over here, this will be returned here, and we are assigning it to the window.xml HTTP, the global object over here. So once the function has done its job, we don't need the function anymore. Now we will write this onload function. Inside we need an array for dates. We also need an array for GDPs. And now we want the data in JSON bar format. So we need it to parse, and we will get our data from response text. So we will use this, and then we will parse it by passing it to the function json.parse, And once we have parsed the object that we have here in our data, this whole object starting from here, this whole object, we are going to get it inside in this constant data set. Now, what we can do is that we can iterate over the data inside this data sets. So this is the whole data, the whole object, and inside this data set then we have this object data. We need to access this data, and this data is an array, so we need to iterate over this data, this array, in order to get the years and in order to get the GDPs. So we will iterate over this data set data. Let's call that an element when we iterate over this array. So let's call this one element, like this is one element, this is another element, this is yet another element, and inside this element then we have year and then we have GDP. So once we get the element, what we do is we push in the GDPs, like in this GDPs array, we push into it the GDP which is at the subscript 1. This is at subscript 0, this is at subscript 1. So inside one element at index 0 we have the year, and at index 1 we have the GDPs. So that is why we are pushing 1 over here. And then inside the dates array we can push the date which is at index 0. Okay, now we have written the onload function and we have these arrays, populated dates and GDPs, and they will be populated once we send the request on this XML HTTP object that we have here, .send, then we can have this. If you want to see, so we can do a console.log on it. Like, let's do it on the GDPs. So we go to the index.html file, we open it with live server. Here we click do right click, inspect, and okay, here we can see an error, uncaught type error, XML HTTP.response text is not a function, which means that we have done something wrong by calling a function, and it's not a function, so we have to remove these brackets. We save it again and we do a refresh, and here we can see our GDPs. So these are all the GDPs, 275 record. This is the first GDP, the second GDP, and so on. Similarly, we can print the dates as well. So that means that we have successfully received data from the API, and our onload function works after sending the request to the server, to the API. And now we have data both inside the dates and the GDPs. We don't need this console.log anymore. Now we are going to write some more code, but we are still inside this function unload. Remember that we are still here inside it. And we will write a few more functions and call them here from inside this unload. So we will create scales, and for that we will make a function define scales, and that scales need data, our dates and GDPs arrays. So we have already access to them over here. We have seen that we have data inside these dates and GDPs now, so we are passing these arrays over here. Next we will need to create axes, the x-axis and y-axis. And for that, we need to pass this scales object, and we need to pass the SVG object. Then we need another function to create the bars. Like if you look at the our data, this bar, these bars, each bar representing one data element. Like we have 275 data elements, 275 GDPs, so we have 275 bars over here. So we need a function for creating that bars, and we need to pass it dates, we need to pass it GDPs, and we need to pass it scales in order to scale them so that we have all that data on the canvas in one chart. And we need to create source, link, and date. And we will pass it the data set. So this creates source, link, and date function. This is for this. More info at this. This is the link that we can get the data from. This is the PDF report, and this is the date updated on. So for that, we need to write also a function to show that. So let's start from defining the scales. And we need array dates and GDPs. So we are passing here these arrays dates and GDPs as arguments. Now we need to find out what is the minimum date and what is the maximum date. D3 has already functions d3.min and d3.max in order to help us to find out the minimum and the maximum, both the minimum GDP and the maximum GDP, as well as the minimum date and the maximum date. So let's write a constant min date using d3 function d3.min. We pass the array dates to it, and getting one date at a time, we know here that we have here the dates as strings here. So the dates here, they are strings. We need to change them to a date object, and for that we need to use the JavaScript function new date, passing the date element to it. The date is a string here, passing to it so that we get the date object. This will tell us what is the minimum date in the whole array of dates. Max date, so we have min date and max date now. Let's find out the max GDP. We need to pass the array of GDPs. We get one GDP, and then we need to return that GDP, the one that is the biggest in the whole array of GDPs. We don't need a minimum GDP. We can just start from zero to the max GDP, whatever it is in the whole array of GDPs. Now that we have min date, max date, and GDP and the max GDP, we need to scale the data. So for that, we start with the xscale. We use the D3 function scale linear. And now we need to give it the domain. So in this case, the domain, we can start from 0 to the max GDP. So this is our domain. We don't have to start from the minimum GDP. We just start from the 0 all the way up to the maximum GDP. This is our domain. And what should be the range? So we have to adopt it so that we can show this GDP, all these GDPs on our SVG canvas. And for that, we have to keep in mind the size of our SVG as well as the paddings that we are doing. Like we have to leave a little bit space. Like we need to leave a little bit space here for this data. We also need to leave a little bit space here on the right side. Similarly, on the Y scale, we need to leave a little bit space over here, and we need to leave a little bit space or a little bit space over here. So we need to scale things both on the x-axis as well as on the y-axis. So for the domain, we start from 0 up to the max GDP, and from the range, we start from padding.x. Like if you remember, we have here padding on the x-axis, we have already defined it as 60, and on the y-axis we have 30. The size of our SVG is width is 900 and height is 500. Keep this in mind when we are going to do the calculations now. We will be using SVG size.width, SVG size.height, similarly padding.x and padding.y. So x is 60 and y is 30. So for the range, padding.x, then SVG size dot width, so the size of the width minus padding dot x, and it is still bigger on this side. We can leave x, which is 60, we can leave 60 here on the left side, but on the right side we don't need that much place. On the left side we have to put data over here, so we need 60s. So we can take padding.x. Here we don't need padding.x. So we can divide the x with something so that it becomes minimum, less than here. So let's divide it with, for example, 3. So here we have 60 now, and here we have 60 divided by 320, and we subtract that 20 from the average size, from the width of the SVG. So we start from 60, we don't start from 0 here on the x-axis, we don't start from here, we start from 60 from here, and then we don't go all the way up to the width of the SVG. We don't go up to the SVG size.width, we go minus this portion. So that would be padding.x/3. So this is now how we have done on the x scale. Now, so the minimum year is 1950 and the maximum year is 2015. But we are doing here something wrong. We are not passing the dates here. We are passing the GDP. So we should pass the min date and the max date instead. So the domain is the min date and the max date. And then we scale it on the x-axis over here as explained. Now we need to scale the GDPs on the y-axis. So we need another const y scale, and this time we are going to use the function D3.scaleLinear. We need to define the domain. The domain, we start from 0 GDP and then we go to the max GDP. And for the range, we have to consider the height now because we are on the y-axis now. We don't leave any space over here on this side, but we need to leave space on that side. So we start for the range from the high SVG size dot height, and then we subtract padding.y and we go all the way down up to padding.y. So if you remember, padding.y is just 30. So here we start from average svg size.height minus padding.y. So the full height of the svg is this one, svg size.height, and then we subtract the padding here, 30, and then we go all the way up to padding.y, which means all the way up. Just leave here 30. So this is the total height. We leave 30 here, and then we go up all the way here. So this is the range up to this point. So now we have the scales. So we have both the X scale and the Y scale. We can return from here both these scales in an object like X scale and Y scale. Okay, so this was our function define scales, and we are returning this X scale and Y scale from this function define scales. So once we return from here in this scales, we have this object which has both X scale and Y scale as the key and as well as the value. Now we need to create axes, and for that axis we need to pass this object scales and the SVG to this function create axis. So let's start writing the function create axis. Create axis. So we need the scales here and we need the SVG here, which we are passing over here as arguments here to this function create axis. So we have the SVG here already. We append to it G, and what is G? Here is G. SVG, scalar vector graphics element, is a container used to group other SVG elements. So we need a container in order to group different SVG elements together. Transformations applied to the G element are performed on its child element. So any transformation that we apply to this container G, it will be applied to all the child elements. So that is why we are appending G over here. Let's apply the attributes. So the ID, x-axis, and we can call D3.axis bottom. This is for the bottom, like this one here. This is the bottom and this is the left. So we use axis left here and we use axis bottom here. So D3.axis bottom, and then we need to give it scales.xscale. So here we have already done the x scaling and we have it here in the object scales. So we are passing that scales.xscale to the D3axis bottom function, and we are calling it over here. Transform, translate, zero to SVG size dot height minus padding dot y. Okay, so what are we doing here? What is this transform and what is this translate? Let's see a transformation. Get introduced to transformation functions. So there are different functions, all these functions, but we will talk about only this translate, which we are using over here. So transformation is an attribute of SVG that helps in transforming one or more SVG elements. It can take one or more, one of the following values, and we are using translate here. So translate is an important functionality in D3.js and is used to move the SVG element inside the web page. So our SVG, it is inside a web page. This is our SVG and it is inside this web page. So this SVG, okay, to move the SVG element inside the web page, it takes two values, namely X and Y. So here we are giving it X and Y, two values over here. This is one value, and after the comma, which is we have another value. So this is the X value and this is the Y value. The X value translates the SVG element along the X-axis, while Y translates the SVG element along the Y-axis. Let's take let's look at this example. For example, we have here the body. Selecting the body, we are appending an SVG with the height 320 and the width of the SVG is 400. And then we have the style border, solid 8 pixel red, so that we can see where the SVG is because of this red border and 8 pixel border. And then we make a rectangle inside this SVG. We are appending a rectangle over here. So the rectangle has to start from somewhere, so that X point is 50, the Y point is 50. So we start from 50, 50, the top corner of this rectangle, and then the height of this rectangle is 100 and the width of this rectangle is 150. And we fill this rectangle with this color. Okay, now we don't need to talk about this transition and duration here, but we need to talk about this transform and translate. So we are applying this attribute transform and translate exactly like we are doing here. This is our transform and this is our translate. So now that we are translating here, we have passed 150 and 150. And when we run this code, we will see what happens. Like this is line 15. So if we look at line number 15 here, this is where actual magic happens, where we use the translate 150 and 150 value of the transform attribute to translate the rectangle 150 pixels along the x-axis and 150 pixels along the y-axis. So if we run this code, you can see here that it starts from here and then it goes 150 on the x-axis, but at the same time it goes down 150 on the y-axis as well. So that is how we use the transform and the translate. So this is for the create x-axis. We are talking about the x-axis. We are talking about the transformation and the translation of the x-axis, which is here now. Okay, let's go back now to our appending of the SVG. Now we need to append another SVG. Another G, another group, another container. We need to give it an ID. Like here we had ID x-axis. Here we will have the ID y-axis. We will call D3.axis left. This is for the y-axis here. This was axis bottom. Here we have axis left. So we have axis left over here. And we need to pass it the scale. So we have this object scales and we have y scale over here. Now we need to transform and translate. So we are passing this transform and we need to translate, and we need to translate it on y-axis padding.x. So here we just need to translate it this much. 60. We know that the value of padding.x is 60. This padding.x, this is here 60. So we need to translate this much from here up to here. So we are moving 60 towards the right. So that is why we have here this padding dot x. So we need to translate the y-axis 60 towards the right here. Okay. Now that we have done that as well, and according to the requirements of the freecodecamp, we need to use and give it a class uptick. If we don't do it, then the use cases that they have given here in the free code project, they have written test cases for each use case, and then if we don't do it, then those test cases will be failed. Therefore, we have to use this class and this tick as required by the freecodecamp project. So now we have done here scaling. Create x-axis, we have appended here for the x-axis, and we have also done appending here for the y-axis, and because of that now we can see here that we have our x-axis and we have our y-axis. Okay, now that we have done this create axis, we need to write the function create bars, and that requires we need to pass dates, GDPs, and scales. The scales, the dates, and the GDPs arrays. So let's write that function now here. So we need to pass here the dates, GDPs, and scales. We start with the SVG. We dot select all rect. Rect stands for rectangles. We are selecting all rectangles. We don't have any rectangle at the moment in our SVG, but that is how D3 works. We start from select all rectangles, and then we append one rectangle at a time in the next lines, in the coming lines. So this rectangle, these rectangles will be shown here to show the data. Like if you look at our complete this here, so this line, yellow line, it is actually a rectangle. This is another rectangle. This is another rectangle. Each rectangle shows one data point, like we have here in data. This is represented by one rectangle. This is represented by another rectangle inside the graph. So that is what we are going to make now. So we select all the rectangles, and then we need to bind the data, and the data comes from the GDPs. Not only the GDPs, we also need the dates. That is why we have the array dates as well here, but we will show here how to do it when we write the code for that. So we supply the GDP array over here, and then we call the enter function, which enables us to append one rectangle at a time. So here we selected all the rectangles. Now we are appending one rectangle at a time using the data here. We need to set the attribute x, and here we write a function which gets d and I. This d is data, one data element. For example, if we look at our data over here, this d represents one data element. So this I is for the index, like what is the index of this inside the array GDPs. Like if we have a whole array of GDPs, it is at index, this is 0, 1, 2. So this is at index 2. So that index we are showing here. So once we have index of this 2, this if the GDP is at index 2, the corresponding year is also at index 2. If this GDP is at index 1, the year is also at appendix 1. So this index we can use this index to get access to any date inside this dates array and to any GDP inside the GDPs array using this index. So we have the object scales here. We can use that scale and pass the date object here, but we don't have a date here, we have GDPs here. So what we are going to do is, first we need to go to the dates array, and where in the dates array we need to go to the dates array and get data at index I. We already have access to the index here, so using that index inside the dates array we get access to the date, but that date might not be in the date format. So what we do is that we use the function new date, and now it is an object date. So the attribute X, we have D, we have index, and we are scaling it over here, but inside we are also converting it to a date object. We can do the same for the attribute Y. We don't need the index over here because on the y-axis, if you look here at the graph, on the y-axis here we need GDPs only. We don't need the dates over here. Here we need X. On the x-axis we need dates, but on the y we need GDPs only. So here on the x-axis we need dates, but on the y we need directly the GDPs, and we have access directly to the GDP. So this D is directly the GDP. We can directly return the GDP here. So what is the GDP here? This is D, because we get D and we return that D. But we need to scale it, and in order to scale it we need to pass it to the functions, to our object, using our object's scales and then Y scale. So whatever is the value of D, like let's look at our data. For example, if it is 246.3 or if it is 250.1, we need to scale it. That is why we are passing it to the scales object and then .y scale. So we need to scale this D and then show it on the y-axis. Okay, what should be the width and height of this rectangle? Like each rectangle here, this has a height and this has a width. So the width svg size dot width, and we subtract the padding and make the padding a little bit bigger by multiplying it with 1.33, and then we divide the whole by the length. In this case the length is 275 because we have 275 GDPs in the array 275. The height okay, so we get a data element here on the height, each data element that we get here, and the svg size dot height and then we need to scale it on the y scale. So we pass this D to it, and then we subtract the padding on the y. So we subtract padding dot y here to leave this y here, from the svg size.height. So each data element that is passed to this function, we take the height of the svg size, but we subtract it after scaling it on the y scale. This data element that we get, we scale it on the y scale element, but we also subtract the padding here on the top here. Okay, so here we are just leaving 40. We know that padding.x is 30, so we are multiplying it by 1.33, so it becomes almost 40. So we are subtracting 40 on the width side here, but here we are subtracting only after scaling it padding.y, here 60. Okay, so now we can see here that we have our bar chart. What if we want to show different colors for different triangles? For example, we want to show one color for odd and one color for even, or one color for one data point and one color for another data point. What we can do is that we can write code that does it for us. So like, let's say we write fill. So we fill the triangle with different colors. I is for the index and D is for the data element. So let's check it. If it is even, which means that the remainder is 0 after taking the modulus with 2, then we can give one color, and if it is odd, then we can give it another color. So let's define the color for this case. 150, 80%, and 50%. But if it is not even and if it is odd, then let's define the color 150, 80%, and 40%. And this should be in quotes. So we can see here that those that are even, they have this color, but those that are odd, they have a different color. So HSL, here you can see what is an HSL in CSS. It is used for hues, saturation, and lightness. And hue is a degree on the color from 0 to 360. 0 is red, 120 is green, and 240 is blue. Saturation is a percentage value. 0% mean a shade of gray, and 100% is the full color. I actually used this here. You can just change the value here and see different color. Like let's change it to 20%, and you can see that you get another color. You can change, for example, here the saturation to 60% and convert, and you can see that you have a different color over here. So here you can even see the web shape version. So for this HSL color, you can even use this, the hexa color. Okay, let's go back now. If you want to do the same thing using CSS, then you can do it like that. For example, you can write class, the name of the class, let's say bar, for example. Or you can dynamically assign different classes, like you have one class bar and another bar2. So what you can do is that you can do the same thing as we did above. Like you have get data and index, and then you say, let's say if the index is even, then you can apply the class bar, and otherwise you can apply the class bar2. So for that, you have to write two different classes in your CSS file, like bar and bar2. We have, for example, here like dot bar, and we have dot bar2. And we have for hovering effect as well, that bar colon hover and that bar 2 colon hover. So that is how you do it over here. So for even case, you apply the class bar, but for the odd case, you apply bar 2. I'm going to comment all these 3 lines because they are not the requirement of the freecodecamp, but that is how you do it. I would do it like this one, like these 2 lines dynamically. But according to the requirement of the freecodecamp, so that we could pass their test cases, we are going to write just one class, bar. And then we need to write another attribute. According to the requirement of the freecodecamp project, it must have this data, date, it gets d colon index, and then we go to the dates array at index I. At this index, we go to the dates array and get the date. So that is one requirement of the project. Another one is that we should also have GDP, data dash GDP, and for that we get D and we simply return D. This is also a requirement of the freecodecamp that we should have an attribute data dash GDP with the value of the D, with the value of the GDP. Okay, if we come over here and we look at the ready-made graph, so when we come over here, we have different mouse events like mouse over and mouse out. When the mouse is out, we show no tooltip. We see no tooltip. But when the mouse is over, we see a tooltip over here with date and the GDP in billions of dollars. So for that, we are going to write 2 events, mouse over and mouse out. So on mouse over and on mouse out. That is what we are going to write. So on mouse over, we get the event mouse over as well as the D, the data. And then we write the function here, the body of the function. Let's create a variable beel D dot to string. And then we replace inside that. So we are using the replace function. So when we get GDP here, we are using this regular expression. For regular expression, just Google a cheat sheet like here, regular expression cheat sheet, and then just study here everything that you have, all these symbols, that how we use all these symbols to make a regular expression for us. So we are using this to replace it with $1 so that we can see it like in billions of dollars. This data that we have in GDPs, we want to see it like, we want to show it like this in billions. So we can see here the dollar symbol, and then we have the data shown here in billions of dollars. So that is why we are using this regular expression and replacing it with this string inside this D. But first we take the D and convert it to string so that we can use the string function replace. Okay, now that we have this, we go to D3 and select, and we select the tooltip. Remember, we created a tooltip with ID tooltip. So we can now refer to that ID tooltip and style it. So we can style the opacity so that we can see it on the screen. On the left, we take this event E +6. Why +6? Because we want it 6 towards the right of a rectangle. Whenever our mouse is on any rectangle, we just don't want the tooltip over the rectangle. We want it towards the right side. That is why we are adding +6 over here. E.pagex +6 pixels. And top E.page y +px. So here we want it on the same level on the y-axis, but on the x-axis we want it 6 pixels towards the right. So style top comma E.page y plus px pixels. Now we need to write the HTML for this tooltip so that we can see it here for this div. So what we do is that we write the HTML. We start with a paragraph, and inside this paragraph we write first the date, like here you can see here the date, and then we show the year, the date, and then inside we need to access the dates array, and inside the date we need an index here, but we have only D here, we don't have the index, so we have to get the index from this D, and that D is a GDP which is inside the GDP's array. And how do we get the index of this D? We have a JavaScript function index of, and we supply D. So that D that we have over here, we give it to the function index of in the JavaScript. So we get the index of this element D inside the array of GDPs. Once we get that index, we supply that index to this dates array, and inside the dates array we go at that particular index to get the date and show it here, and then we see the date over here. Okay, that was the first line. Then we need to go to the next line. For that we write another paragraph tag, and inside that paragraph tag we need to show money, the GDP, and that GDP is already here in this variable. But since here we are also showing dollar before each amount, therefore we need an extra dollar here as well. So we need an extra dollar to show the symbol dollar over there, and then we need the amount dollar, and then we need a space, and then we need to write billion, so that we can see here a space between the amount and the billion, but no space between the amount and the dollar. Therefore we have no space over here. Next we need another attribute according to the requirement of the freecodecamp project, data.date. And this attribute data date, according to the requirement of the freecodecamp project, it should have a date, the corresponding date. So we go to the GDPs, and then we get the index of this data element that we have. And once we have the index of that element here, we go into the date and get the date from the dates array. And that was all about the mouse over event. Let's go to the next event, which is mouse out. when the mouse goes out, we don't need any arguments, and we just need to return D3.select with the ID of tooltip. We have to style it. We have to style the opacity so that it becomes invisible. So the opacity should be set to 0, and the left to 0, and the right, the top to 0 as well. So here, when we go out, so it disappears. That is the event because of the event mouse out. So this was all about our function create parse. So we have created rectangle for each data point, and we have attached the mouse over and the mouse event, the mouse out and the mouse over events for the tooltip, so that whenever the mouse is on a rectangle, we fire this mouse over, and when the mouse leaves the rectangle, we fire this mouse out is fired. Okay, now that we are done with create parse, let's write the function create source link and date. Create source link and date. This is the link and this is the date. So that is what we are going to do in this function create source link and date, and it takes the dataset object. This is the dataset object. So we write the function here. D3.select. We select the main inside in our HTML here, this. And then we append a div, and then we give the attribute ID of DESC. This is the requirement of the freecodecamp project. Then we take D3.select and we take the DESC. This is the ID, which means that we are selecting this again, the DESC. We append a paragraph to it, and we set the text of this one, data updated on. We have the data set here, this data set, and inside this data set, if we go back to our data here, this is our data set. We have here updated here, updated 8. That is what we need inside the data set. So data set dot updated 8. So we access that, and then here you can see that this is in this format, and when we show it here on the web page, it is only the year, the month, and the date. It is not in this format as shown over here. We don't want this extra stuff. So for that, we need to do here some processing. We need to use a regular expression in order to get rid of the extra part over there. So for that, we use this regular expression and we use the function match. We can take that to the next line like that. Okay, so that was this date updated on. Now let's go to this portion, the URL, the link. And for that, we need to do it once again, d3.select. We select the ID, DSC. We append a paragraph. And the text should be more info 8. And then we have the data set, and inside the data set we have description, and we use the matching pattern. And that matching pattern is http.pdf. Or we can take it to the next line to make it more clear. So now we are done with that part, with the create source link and date part. This was this create source link and date. Okay, so this was our create source and link and date, which is here. This was our create bars method. Oh, the height, we don't need to comment this line because this shows the data, the height on the graph. Like here, this height, so we can't just comment it like this. It will never be shown if we comment that line. Also, if we come over here, so here is one problem here. This is GDP's dot index of, not the array. So this bracket, this is extra. Now we save it, and here is one problem with misspelling. This is E, page Y. Okay, so we save it, we go to index.html, open with live server, and now we can see that this is our graph. But we can't see the URL, so, and the date format is also not correct. Let's go back to our code and check the problem. Okay, this is the problem. This is not at the correct place. So this is like we are applying the match after getting the data from the data set updated age string, and then we apply the function match to the string and the regular expression. Similarly here also we have this dot match, and then we apply this pattern, and then we close the text. Similarly, this closes the text as well. Now let's go back and see, and now the format is correct, and we have the URL link as well. Okay, we can see the tooltip as well. Now let's check the test cases. So we select the D3 bar chart, we run the tests, and we can see that all the tests have been passed, 14 out of 14. We can see the details here as well. So these were all the tests that were required for passing this project for the D3.js course on the Free Code Camp.